All right, guys, so I let the doors dry for a little over 24 hours to make sure that that glue is fully cured up. That way, it just was because we're going to be applying a lot of stress to the joints here, I want to make sure there's no chance of breaking them. And so when we try to fit these into the opening, what we want to do is we want to start with the top and bottom because this is where we have exposed end grain. Our sides are going to be super easy to clean up because we're just hand planing the edge of a board. It's very easy, very straightforward to do. But on the top and bottom, we have this exposed end grain that we're going to have to plane through. And so the best way to do this is with a low angle jack like I've got here. Now, preferably if you can get a 25-degree blade, that's going to do a lot better for you. I have a 40-degree blade in here right now, so it's going to be a little bit tougher to get through the end grain, but it's still going to be completely doable. And so there's a few things you want to make sure when you're actually working down the door, the tops and bottom of the door. You want to make sure that you're coming in from both directions with your hand plane. So you're going to start on this side, make sure that the end grain is flushed up with your top bar. Then you're going to come around to the other side and make sure that this end grain is flushed up with the top bar. Then once you've done that, you're just going to go and take equal passes, basically just past the middle from either side. This will make sure that you're going down an equal amount. The reason you can't just go across is because then you'll break out fibers on the opposite side. Anytime you're cutting over end grain, you're going to break out fibers on this side. That's why when you see me using a shooting board, I always have a piece that is perfectly flushed up against the end of the board that I'm cutting to help support those fibers when they're getting cut, and still generally they'll break out even on the shooting board. So I want to be very careful here not to break it out. So the best thing to do here is to get your door nice and clamped up. I've got my box and vise set up on the end of my bench here so that I can easily work from both directions. I can easily go from this side and spin around, go the other way. And so when it comes to actually checking the fit of your door, you want to make sure that you're fitting it in the right spot. So I know this is going to be my right-hand door, this is going to be my left-hand door, and you need to make sure that you make that you decide that before you actually go through this process. Because what you're doing is fitting this door into this physical space. You don't want this space and this space may be different. Again, this is such a large piece that there's no guarantee that this whole box area here is perfectly square. So when you're fitting up doors, you want to make sure you're fitting them to a specific spot. And with that, you want to make sure you're not trying to match this to this just yet. That'll come once this door actually fits in the spot. What you want to make sure of is that when you push this edge up against this edge, they line up perfectly straight, and then you can start to work on getting this to fit in. And so the best way to do this is to start with your bottom edge of your door and make sure that it is square to this edge. That's a very easy way to work with it. And then any difference can be made up and fixed on the top here. Now, you could do it the opposite way. You could start on the top and work your way and work on the bottom, but I would rather do it this way because it's much easier to rest it on the bottom using gravity rather than trying to hold it up here. But then when you're checking this, you want to make sure that you're perfectly squared up against that side edge. So bring the door out a little bit, push it up there nice and square. And so we can see that we're just barely at the line on this side, and this other corner, the top right corner here, is still a little bit too high. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to only work on this top corner and just bring it down very, very slowly, and it looks like right to about there. So we need to taper this whole section down to about here, then we'll be perfect. Again, this is because there's no guarantee that this whole thing is square, but it's one of the biggest benefits about working with hand tools. You can specifically work on targeted areas like this. So we've got both doors fitted in now. They're both super tight on the vertical. They're both wedged in there really good. We've got this one sticking out just a little bit, covering up the other door here, because this is where we have to now go in and remove this excess material. And so the way I'm going to go about getting these doors down to their proper width is I'm going to use the table saw. Now the reason I'm using the table saw rather than the hand plane is just purely because I don't have an easy way to hold these and support them either in my box and vise or on my bench to actually use the low angle jack. There's also a lot of material to remove here, so the low angle jack is going to make it a little more complicated to get it accurate, and over the length of these things, it's going to be hard to keep it perfectly straight and square, and to remove an equal amount of material from it. And so I also want to get these doors perfectly centered. I want to get that seam nicely centered on the middle of the cupboard here. And so by using the table saw, I can take off the exact same amount from each door and slowly move them apart, or the center parts apart, to give me a nice equal distance from each other. Now, it's going to be a little bit tricky to get this to work properly because I got to make sure that I'm only taking off very small amounts at a time. It's very easy. Again, that's one of the downsides to power tools is it's very easy to instantly screw something up. You know, something twists, something binds. You now wasted a couple days making a door, and now you have to go make another one and hopefully get it to match the first one. So what we got to do is just take it very slow, very methodical. And so if you're wondering why I couldn't use the table saw for the top and the bottom, is because these are not perfect 90 degrees to each other. Now, they're pretty damn good, surprisingly enough, but again, anytime you're doing joinery or hand laid out joinery, you're always going to have some imperfections in there. And so that's one of the big benefits of the hand plane is that I can work and make sure these doors fit into these imperfections. And so now what I'm trying to do is, because I've made sure that these are perfectly in line with the top and the bottom one, and this is perfectly referenced against this outer edge, I know that this vertical is what needs to end up being perfectly parallel to this vertical. And that's just, again, it's a really easy way to work there. And same thing on this side, the vertical is parallel with the actual cupboard's vertical section. So I can use the table saw here because I want these to stay perfectly parallel to each other, whereas the top and bottom, there's no guarantee that they are parallel to each other or at a 90-degree angle to either of our sides. So that's why you can't use a table saw for the top and bottom, but you can use a table saw to get your widths down to the right width. So we're just going to jump over on the table saw. And again, really important here, I'm going to be using a designated ripping blade. So that's that 24 tooth blade because that's going to leave a much better surface finish on these doors compared to if I was to use a combination blade. Alright, so now it's time to install the hinges into the doors. So for the hinges for this, I got some really nice Horton Brasses hinges in the dark antique coloring. Now these are solid brass hinges, which is really good. And so the simplest way to think about it with the hinge is you need to make sure that this barrel, which is the actual hinging area, is able to fully open and close. And so on the hinges, generally the hinge manufacturer will set these barrels up with enough clearance so that you know where to put them. So it's very easy to tell. You just go to basically the bottom of that line there. And so all I'm going to do is set up my marking gauge here to match that line, but you want your basically to line up right there so that you're getting to that exact depth. And so in most cases, because these are designed for 3/4 inch stock, they're probably not going to go all the way into the stock, which is good. It's exactly how you expect it to be. It's not really a problem. And so you're going to just take your marking gauge, mark a line there, and then work back to it with chisels, router plane, all the different tools until this piece sits perfectly flush in. Now, one of the things that messed me up a lot when I first got into installing cabinet doors with hinges on it is that I thought you had to fully clear out enough space for this to be completely open. But all you need to do is inset the actual leaf, which is the flat area of the hinge. Only this area needs to be flat within the actual cabinet door itself. And so you might have been wondering earlier why we made the cabinet doors a perfect friction fit into the cupboard. And the reason for this is because now we can measure, we know that this corner and this corner match the corners on the cupboard exactly. So now when I measure in, 5 inches from this edge, I know that if I measure in 5 inches from the bottom edge of the cupboard, it's going to be the exact same distance. Same thing from the top, it's going to be the same distance in. And this is really helpful for installing hinges because now when I want to install the hinges, I just have to measure in on the exact same. I can get them very accurately placed on both things because it's hard to install hinges, or it's hard to mark out hinges while you're holding a door like this. It's not very accurate. So by getting them that perfect friction fit initially, it makes your job a lot easier later on. And so the only real tools you need to do this are a few different chisels to just get it into the little corners and that you need to, and a router plane makes it really easy, but you got to be really careful with the router plane when you're dealing with hinges like this. Because these hinges don't go all the way through, you got to be careful with your router plane to not break through the back edge. Again, one option you do have is you could just go all the way through with the hinges. If you're new to installing hinges, I highly suggest doing that because it does make it a lot easier because you can just use a router plane and just easily cut through the material the whole way. Again, this is never an area you're ever going to see unless you're taking the door off, but just for the sake of it, because I feel like trying to be a little bit fancy with it, I'm going to make sure that I don't cut off that back section so the hinge is kind of hidden from the inside of the cabinet. Okay, so now this is the fun part of attaching hinges to a cupboard like this. So because we cut the hinge mortises into our doors, a much more accurate way to locate them in the cupboard itself is to put both of the doors in. Because they're both those nice tight friction fits, they will push themselves out and hold themselves against the sides all really nice and easily. Then I could just go in and put a marking knife line, as you guys saw. Once I've done that, I've now gone through and scribed our cross lines and our depth line, so our 5/8 depth line for the hinge. So now I just have to go on the floor here, work through and cut out the hinge holes or hinge mortises the same way you guys have already seen me do. The only difference is now I'm doing it on the ground. Theoretically, if you could get this up on the bench, it would be a heck of a lot easier to do it that way, but this thing weighs a lot and I really did not feel like trying to manhandle it up onto my workbench. So I'm just going to do it on the floor here, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but I've only got 4 hinges to do here, so I'm not too worried about it. And so I went through and made sure that all of our gaps on all of our edges are the same. The only where we have a little bit of a problem right now is right in the middle. I need to just loosen up this gap a little bit on the top section, which is not going to be hard at all. I just haven't done it yet because I don't want to have to take the doors on and off again. So when I figure out what else I need to do, what else needs to be done to these doors, then I'll take the doors off one last time and then do everything to them and then put them back on and leave them there until we then switch out the screws for the brass ones. So in here right now, I actually only have the steel screws. I've got all 3 mounted into the main cupboard, so the actual framework, and then I've got 1 in each hinge attached to the door. And so all that's left to do on the doors here is I need to go order the glass panes I'm going to be putting in the upper areas here. And so that's going to be a super simple process. I'm going to just order them from a shop here in Calgary. I don't know how much they're going to cost, but it shouldn't be that expensive, I'm hoping. Then on the inside here, I'm going to put some magnets into the fronts of the shelves here so that we have something to actually hold our doors in. Because right now, as you can see, the one on the right here has a little bit of a tendency to come out. So just by putting a magnet into each of the shelves, we will be able to hold that door in nice and tight. One thing I should mention though is that you guys might have picked up on it if you guys have done a lot of woodworking yourselves. When I was installing the hinges on these cabinet doors, what I should have done, the proper way to go about this would have been before I glued any of this up, I should have cut the hinge mortises into my vertical pieces on my actual cupboard itself. That would have made it a lot easier. I wouldn't have had to crawl around on the ground and it would have come out a little bit cleaner. The mortises in the actual cupboard verticals themselves are a little bit gnarly just because the back edge was quite hard to get at with the chisel and get it at it accurately and cleanly. So it's not as nice as on the actual doors, which again, it's in an area you're never really going to notice or see, but it's just one of those things that kind of annoys me slightly. So like I said, the best way to have done this would have been to do it before anything was cut. So one of the first bits of joinery that I would have cut would have been these hinge mortises. Then when I got to this stage where I'm at now, I could have done the exact same thing, fitting the doors up so they're a nice tight fit, transferring the lines over with a marking knife, and then cutting the mortises the same way you guys saw me do it. So it's just a different order of operations, but it would have made my life a lot easier. Now, crawling around on the ground like I did was not super hard. It was kind of painful, I will admit, and a little bit awkward to get in there and do the stuff. But I managed to get it done, and our doors, as you can see, are fully functional. So it's all fine and dandy, whichever way you want to do it. But yeah, if you cut the hinge mortises before you actually put the case together, it's going to be a lot easier to get it done. Alright, so I was getting ready to actually install the knobs onto the doors here, and I came over a small oversight on my part. So these, with the machine screws compared to the actual, the handles that I was going to be using, these stick out on the inside of the door, which means that I have to just inset the head of this just by a little bit. Just, slightly into the wood so that it's not hitting against the shelf, because then that'll make our doors stand out more than I want them to. The only problem is, as you can see here, I put the magnets in, and they are very, very, very close to the hole where I have the knob screws going through. So this is a very tricky thing. I did it on one door, and I figured I should probably show you guys what I'm doing here, because all I need to do is run a 3/8 bit and just hold it centered on this hole, just for like half a second, cut a little groove, a little hole in there, and that's just enough for this. But the problem is this magnet is right on the edge. So luckily with the bits that I have, they seem like they can actually take just enough off the magnet to get it in there. I don't actually want to try drilling into the magnets themselves, because that's probably not great for these bits. Alright guys, so we're now done with the back panel. I've got it all attached, all nicely finished, and it's looking really good. So I didn't really show much of the process for this because it's kind of a simple and kind of boring thing to watch. Basically all these pieces are just 4/4 stock that I cut in half, milled down to just under 3/8 of an inch. And then I went through and I put a bevel on both of the all four long edges of each piece on the table saw with the blade at 45. Then went through, drilled the holes for the screws, lining up perfectly on the shelves, and countersunk them into all that. So it's really not that exciting of a process, so I didn't show too much of it. And I think in the future, when I make back panels for furniture pieces like this, I want to get a little bit more complex with it, just because this is a fairly simple thing. But one of my favorite things about this is you can see that each one is in a book-matched pair. And so you might be wondering why I went with so many screws on this thing. There's 2 screws per board and per shelf, so I think there's almost 100 screws in the back of this thing, and the shelves on the back of this cabinet here look like an absolute pincushion. And the reason for that is so that if the drawers ever get stuck, I don't have to disassemble the whole back panel. Realistically, I can just go in and I can remove just this piece, punch the drawer out, and it's not a problem. Or I can remove a section of these if they ever crack. It just makes it a little bit easier compared to if you have like shiplap or something where pieces are overlapping. It makes it a little bit more complex. And then I also went with 2 screws per board rather than just a single screw per shelf, so that they wouldn't cup and bow and warp. Now they have room for movement, but they will also stay flat against those shelves. So it's a much more secure way of holding them on here than if I just put a single screw in there, just because then you would get a lot of cupping and warping, and I don't really want that. So we're now almost done this project. The last thing we need to do is to, well, finish up this whole thing. We've got some little dings and that's here. I wear, big boots in here, and so I've actually ended up kicking this thing a couple times, so I've got a few little black marks here and there. So I have to go and clean those up with some sandpaper. And then the last big thing we have to do is we have to get the drawers together. So in the next video, we're going to be putting together the drawers and fitting them into the top section up here. Now, I can't actually turn the camera around and show you guys that because I have the drawers currently mounted in there and they look spectacular. So you guys are going to like that video. We're doing half blind dovetail drawers. Really nice looking stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.